Crystal McCrory Jones, never looked like someone who would become the center of a mystery that divided everyone who examined it, yet her name would soon be linked to a night filled with unanswered questions, hidden pressure, and a truth that refused to stay clear. What began as a quiet life slowly turned into a case where every detail seemed to tell a different story, pulling investigators in opposite directions. As the evidence unfolded, one chilling question remained at the center of it all. Was Crystal McCrory Jones hiding a carefully planned act, or was she trapped in a tragic accident that spiraled beyond control? Crystal McCrory Jones lived a life that appeared simple, steady, and predictable. She followed a routine that rarely changed, waking up early, organizing her day carefully, and keeping her surroundings neat and controlled. To neighbors and acquaintances, she seemed like someone who valued privacy and stability. There was nothing about her daily habits that suggested she was facing anything unusual. She kept a small social circle and rarely allowed others to get too close to her personal matters, which only added to the impression that she preferred a quiet and uncomplicated life. However, beneath this calm exterior, subtle signs of strain had already begun to take shape. Financial pressure was quietly building, growing stronger with each passing month. Bills that were once manageable started to pile up, and expenses slowly exceeded what she could comfortably handle. On the surface, she continued to maintain the appearance of control, but behind closed doors, the situation was becoming increasingly difficult. Small decisions began to carry more weight, and each financial setback added another layer of stress. Those who interacted with her occasionally noticed a shift in her behavior. She became more reserved than usual, often avoiding deeper conversations about her life. Just questions about her well-being were met with brief and vague responses. Her once calm and composed demeanor began to show moments of distraction, as if her thoughts were constantly occupied by something she could not easily share. Thus, these changes were subtle enough to be overlooked, yet consistent enough to raise quiet concern. At the same time, a new relationship entered her life, bringing with it both hope and complication. Initially, it seemed to offer a sense of relief from her growing pressures. The presence of another person created the appearance of emotional support and companionship. For a short while, it gave the impression that things might improve. However, as time passed, the relationship revealed a more complicated dynamic. It was not as stable or comforting as it first appeared. Instead, it introduced tension and emotional strain that added to the difficulties she was already facing. The balance she had carefully maintained in her life began to weaken. The combination of financial stress and personal complications created a situation that was becoming harder to manage. Despite this, she continued to present herself as composed and in control. She avoided drawing attention to her struggles and made efforts to keep everything hidden beneath the surface of normalcy. What made this situation more unsettling was how ordinary everything still looked from the outside. There were no dramatic changes, no obvious warning signs that something serious was about to happen. The routine continued. The days passed, and life appeared to move forward as usual. Yet, beneath that quiet routine, pressure was building in a way that could not last forever. In hindsight, the early signs were there, hidden in small details and subtle changes. At the time, they did not seem significant enough to suggest anything serious. But those quiet shifts marked the beginning of something far more complex, setting the stage for an event that would later leave more questions than answers. The night everything changed began in a way that seemed completely ordinary. There was nothing unusual about the evening at first glance. The surroundings were calm, and there were no immediate signs of conflict or disturbance. It was the kind of night that would normally pass without leaving any memory behind. But within that quiet setting, something unexpected unfolded, turning an ordinary moment into the center of a mystery that would later draw intense scrutiny. At some point during the night, an incident occurred that would alter everything. Crystal McCrory Jones reported that it was a tragic accident, something sudden and unplanned. According to her account, events escalated quickly, leaving no time to react or prevent what happened. She described the situation as chaotic and confusing, where actions and consequences blurred together in a matter of moments. The explanation she provided seemed straightforward on the surface, suggesting that what took place was simply an unfortunate turn of events. When authorities arrived, they were met with a scene that was difficult to immediately interpret. There were signs that something serious had happened, but the details did not clearly explain how it had unfolded. Certain elements appeared consistent with an accident, while others raised quiet uncertainty. The environment did not offer a single clear narrative. Instead, it presented fragments of a story that needed to be carefully examined. The initial response focused on gathering basic information and preserving the scene. At first, there was no just immediate conclusion that pointed strongly in one direction. It was possible that the situation was exactly as described, a tragic and unexpected incident. However, as investigators began to take a closer look, small details started to stand out. These were not dramatic or obvious clues, but rather subtle inconsistencies that did not fully align with the explanation that had been given. Timing became one of the first points of concern. The sequence of events, as it was described, did not perfectly match the physical evidence present at the scene. There were gaps that were difficult to account for, moments that seemed unclear or slightly out of place. While these discrepancies were not enough to immediately suggest wrongdoing, they created a sense that something was missing from the overall picture. The condition of the surroundings also raised questions. Certain objects were positioned in ways that seemed unusual, and the state of the scene did not entirely reflect the kind of sudden accident that had been described. These details were subtle, requiring careful observation to notice, but once identified, they could not be ignored. They suggested that the situation might have been more controlled than initially believed. As the night progressed and more information was collected, the atmosphere shifted. What began as a possible accident slowly became something more uncertain. Investigators found themselves considering alternative explanations, trying to piece together a sequence of events that made sense of every detail. Each new observation added another layer of complexity, making it harder to accept a simple conclusion. By the end of that night, one thing had become clear. The incident was not as straightforward as it first appeared. Whether it was truly an accident or something more deliberate remained unanswered. But the foundation of doubt had already been established. What seemed like a single moment of tragedy had begun to reveal itself as a puzzle, one that would require much deeper investigation to understand. As investigators moved beyond the initial scene, the case began to take on a heavier and more complex shape. What had once seemed like a single tragic moment was now surrounded by layers of background information that demanded attention. The focus shifted from just what happened that night to what had been happening in the days and weeks leading up to it. It was in this deeper examination that the first serious concerns began to emerge. Financial records became a key part of the investigation. What they revealed was far from stable. There were mounting debts, missed payments, and a pattern of spending that did not align with a secure situation. Transactions showed urgency, as if money problems had reached a critical point. This financial strain suggested pressure that had been building quietly over time, creating a possible motive that could not be ignored. While financial difficulty alone did not explain what had happened, it added an important piece to the puzzle. Attention and turned to her personal life, particularly her relationship. What initially appeared supportive now seemed strained and unpredictable. Evidence pointed to ongoing tension that had been hidden from public view. There were indications of emotional stress and instability, suggesting that the relationship may have been a source of conflict rather than comfort. This raised further questions about what might have been happening behind closed doors, away from the calm image presented to others. Forensic analysis added even more weight to the investigation. Experts carefully examined every detail of the scene, looking for patterns that could explain how events unfolded. Their findings did not fully support the idea of a sudden, uncontrolled accident. Instead, certain elements suggested a sequence that appeared more structured. The placement of objects, the timing of physical evidence, and the overall condition of the scene hinted at actions that may have occurred in a deliberate order rather than in chaos. These findings began to challenge the original account more directly. While it was still possible that the situation had spiraled out of control unexpectedly, the evidence increasingly suggested that there may have been more intention involved. Investigators started to consider whether the incident could have been influenced by decisions made before that night, rather than just reactions in the moment. Another important aspect was the timeline. By reconstructing events leading up to the incident, investigators noticed gaps that were difficult to explain. Certain periods of time were unclear, and the available information did not fully connect. These missing pieces created uncertainty, making it harder to accept a simple explanation. Each inconsistency added to a growing sense that the truth was being obscured. whether intentionally or not. Despite these concerns, the case remained far from resolved. For every detail that suggested planning, there was another that could still fit within the possibility of an accident. The evidence did not point in one clear direction, and this uncertainty made the investigation even more challenging. It forced investigators to consider multiple possibilities at once, weighing each piece of information carefully. By this stage, the case had transformed completely. It was no longer about a single event, but about understanding a series of interconnected factors. Its financial pressure, personal conflict, and forensic evidence all combined to create a picture that was both detailed and unclear. The deeper investigators looked, the more complicated the situation became. Sting them with a growing question that still had no definite answer. As the investigation continued, the case became increasingly difficult to define. What once seemed like a question with two possible answers now felt like a tangled web of uncertainty. Each new piece of evidence added weight, but instead of bringing clarity, it often deepened the confusion. The more investigators uncovered, the harder it became to separate what was intentional from what might have been the result of panic or misjudgment. Digital evidence became one of the most critical areas of focus. Its records of online activity revealed patterns that raised concern. There were searches and actions that appeared unusual given the circumstances. Some of these activities suggested preparation, as if certain scenarios had been considered in advance. The timing of these digital traces became especially important, as they seemed to occur before the incident took place. This discovery led investigators to question whether the events of that night were truly unexpected. At the same time, the interpretation of this evidence was not straightforward. While some experts believed the digital activity pointed toward planning, others argued that it could have been unrelated or misunderstood. Context played a significant role, and without a clear connection, the information remained open to different explanations. This divide in interpretation added another layer of uncertainty to an already complex case. Physical evidence also continued to be examined in greater detail. Small details that were initially overlooked began to take on new meaning. The positioning of items, the condition of the environment, and the sequence suggested by forensic analysis all pointed toward a scenario that might not have been entirely accidental. However, none of these elements alone provided a complete answer. They needed to be considered, even together, and even then, the overall picture remained unclear. Another important factor was behavior following the incident. Actions taken in the immediate aftermath were closely analyzed. Some of these actions appeared inconsistent with what might be expected in a purely accidental situation. There were moments that seemed calculated, as if decisions were being made with awareness rather than confusion. Yet it was also possible to interpret these same actions as the result of shock or fear, where clear thinking was replaced by instinct. This dual interpretation of evidence became the defining challenge of the case. Every detail seemed to support two opposing narratives at once. On one side was the idea of a carefully planned act, influenced by pressure, conflict, and personal struggle. On the other side was the possibility of a tragic accident, where a series of unfortunate events led to an irreversible outcome. As investigators worked through these possibilities, the case began to divide opinions. Some were convinced that the evidence pointed toward intent, believing that too many details suggested preparation and control. Others remained cautious, emphasizing the lack of direct proof and the possibility that the situation had simply been misunderstood. The growing divide made it clear that the truth was not easily accessible. Instead of moving closer to a single conclusion, the investigation seemed to circle around multiple possibilities, each supported by different pieces of evidence. This created a sense of tension that extended beyond the case itself, leaving those involved with more questions than answers. By this stage, it was evident that resolving the case would not be simple. The evidence had become a complex puzzle, one where every piece could fit into more than one interpretation. The deeper the investigation went, the more it revealed just how uncertain the truth could be. As the case approached its conclusion, there was a growing sense that a clear answer might never fully emerge. After months of investigation, analysis, and careful review, the evidence stood complete yet deeply divided. Every detail had been examined, every possibility considered, and still, the central question remained unresolved. What truly happened that night continued to exist between two conflicting explanations. The final stage brought together everything that had been uncovered: its financial struggles, personal tension, forensic findings, and digital records were all presented as parts of a larger picture. Each element carried weight, but none could stand alone as definitive proof. Instead, they formed two competing narratives, each supported by its own interpretation of the same facts. One perspective suggested that the incident had been carefully planned. The financial pressure, combined with personal difficulties, created a possible motive. The digital activity hinted at preparation, while certain aspects of the physical evidence suggested control rather than chaos. But from this point of view, the events of that night were not sudden but the result of decisions made in advance. Every detail that did not align with an accident strengthened this argument, making it seem increasingly plausible. At the same time, an equally compelling argument supported the idea of a tragic accident. The situation could still be explained as a series of events that escalated beyond control. The inconsistencies in the evidence might have been the result of confusion, stress, and panic. Human behavior under pressure does not always follow logic, and actions that seem deliberate in hindsight could have been instinctive reactions in the moment. This interpretation allowed for the possibility that there was no intention, only a situation that spiraled into something irreversible. What made the case so difficult was that neither explanation could completely eliminate the other. Every piece of evidence seemed to fit into both narratives in different ways. A detail that appeared suspicious in one context could seem understandable in another. This constant overlap prevented a single clear truth from taking shape. As the case reached its final outcome, there was no sense of complete closure. The conclusion provided an official resolution, but it did not fully answer the deeper question that had defined the investigation. Instead, it left behind a lingering uncertainty, a feeling that something remained just out of reach. For those who followed the case closely, the lack of clarity became its most haunting aspect. It was not just about what happened, but about the possibility that the full truth might never be known. The story did not end with certainty, but with doubt that continued to linger long after the investigation was complete. In the end, the case of Crystal McCrory Jones stood as a reminder of how complex the truth can be. It showed how evidence, no matter how detailed, can lead to different conclusions depending on how it is understood. Most of all, it left behind a question that refused to be answered, suspended between two possibilities that both felt real and impossible to ignore.